The roar of the motorcycle echoed through the open field, the sound of the engine reverberating off the distant hills. A man, rugged and wild, revved the throttle as he approached a group of Mustang horses grazing lazily in the sun. His leather jacket and rough demeanor suggested a life lived without care, as if he was above the world around him. Among the horses, one stood out, a majestic Mustang, its coat gleaming like polished copper under the bright sun. The biker eyed the horse with a cocky grin, leaning over to rev his engine louder. He couldn't resist the urge to push boundaries. This was his world, a place where strength was defined by who could take control. With a sudden jerk, he jumped off his bike, his boots hitting the dusty earth with a thud. He swaggered toward the horse, looking it over with a dismissive smirk. The Mustang, startled by the sudden noise and movement, reared up slightly, its tail swishing nervously. The biker laughed, thinking it was funny, and without a second thought, he kicked the horse's side, as if the creature was nothing more than an obstacle in his path. The sound of the impact rang out in the quiet air, the horse whinnying in pain. The biker's laughter echoed, believing it was just a harmless prank. But he didn't know that someone had been watching him from a distance, someone who knew all too well what it meant to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. The man watching from afar wasn't just any bystander. He wasn't some random observer who'd happen upon the scene. No, this man had lived a life where strength wasn't just about physical prowess, it was about justice, responsibility, and protecting the vulnerable. As he watched the biker stand there, laughing to himself, something in him snapped. The biker had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The distance between the two men grew shorter with each step the observer took. The biker, still grinning, hadn't even noticed. In his mind, he was untouchable, just another day to show off his power. But little did he know, someone was about to remind him that power doesn't always come from what's on the surface. And as the distance closed, a quiet fury simmered in the observer's chest, a silent promise of consequences. The biker's carelessness was about to be paid for in ways he never expected. The biker still stood there, hands on his hips, basking in his supposed victory over the Mustang. He had no idea that the man who had been quietly observing was closing in on him. With every step the observer took, his thoughts grew darker, more determined. He wasn't just angry, he was incensed by the blatant cruelty, by the thoughtless way the biker had hurt the defenseless animal. The observer was no young man. He had seen his share of injustice and had learned long ago that the world needed people who would stand up for what was right, even if it meant facing off against someone much larger, much stronger, or much more arrogant. He had once been in the military, serving in special forces, but his time there had taught him far more than tactics. It had taught him the cost of standing by when others were wronged. It had taught him that true strength wasn't about power, it was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. The sound of the biker's laughter seemed to mock him as he closed the gap, and with every passing second, the feeling of helplessness within him began to fade. The biker's disregard for the horse and his arrogance in assuming there would be no consequences fueled something deeper in the observer. The Mustang, still unsettled by the sudden attack, pawed the ground nervously, but it calmed slightly as it sensed the observer's presence. He was the one who had raised the animal, who had been there when it was just a foal, its legs shaking as it learned to walk. He had nurtured it, trained it, and loved it like family. As he neared the biker, the observer took a deep breath. He wasn't a man prone to anger. His life had been one of discipline, of calculated moves and strategy. But seeing this young man laugh, thinking he could hurt an innocent creature without facing consequences, struck a chord with him. The biker turned, finally noticing the older man who had come up behind him. His first instinct was to brush it off, but there was something in the way the observer stood, steadily, unwavering, that made him pause. The observer's eyes were calm but intense, focused entirely on the biker. They locked eyes for a moment, and the biker felt a strange unease, as though something wasn't quite right. "Well, what's your problem, old man?" the biker scoffed, the confidence still in his voice but with a hint of uncertainty creeping in. The observer's gaze didn't waver. He simply watched the biker for a moment, sizing him up. "You think it's funny, don't you?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was a dangerous edge to it that caused the biker to take a step back, just a little. "Kicking a defenseless animal, because you can. Because you think there will be no repercussions." The biker's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "It's just a horse, man. What's the big deal?" The observer shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "That's where you're wrong. You're not just dealing with a horse here. You're dealing with someone who takes responsibility for what happens in this world. And what you just did will cost you more than you think." The biker chuckled nervously, thinking the older man was just some crazy old fool trying to lecture him. "You better back off, or I'll..." But the observer wasn't finished. "You'll what?" His voice was steady, unflinching. "You think you can intimidate me like you did that horse? You think your motorcycle makes you untouchable?" The biker's cocky demeanor wavered for the briefest moment. There was something in the observer's calm, measured tone that made him pause. He wasn't used to this, people didn't stand up to him. But there was something about this man that made him rethink his assumptions. Before he could respond, the observer stepped forward, his gaze still fixed on the biker. The world around them seemed to quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "You don't know who I am," the observer said softly, but there was a weight in his words that couldn't be ignored. "But you will soon enough." And with that, the tension between them thickened, hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. The biker felt his heart skip a beat, the confidence he had moments ago slowly turning into uncertainty. But the observer didn't let him speak again. He simply turned and began to walk back toward the Mustang, who had remained still, sensing the shift in energy. The biker stood there, watching, unsure of what to make of this strange encounter. The unease gnawed at him, but he shrugged it off, figuring it was nothing more than an odd run-in with an old man. What he didn't realize, however, was that this wasn't just an ordinary man, this was someone whose actions would soon turn his world upside down. And the Mustang wasn't the only one about to feel the consequences of a single careless act. The biker stood still, staring at the back of the man who had walked off toward the Mustang. For a moment, he considered laughing it off. He had faced worse confrontations before, drunken arguments at bars, petty squabbles with other bikers, even run-ins with the law. This old man, with his slow, deliberate steps and calm demeanor, didn't seem like someone who would bring any real trouble. But something in the back of his mind gnawed at him, a quiet voice telling him that this situation was different. The sense of unease that had gripped him earlier hadn't gone away. It lingered, the weight of it pressing against his chest. The observer reached the Mustang and placed a hand on its back. The horse, still uneasy from the earlier kick, took a step back but calmed as the man spoke softly to it, his voice soothing. The biker watched, confused, unsure of what to make of the scene. What did this guy think he was going to do? Just stand there, talking to a horse, like it was going to change anything? But the biker couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The observer wasn't just some random person who happened to witness a moment of foolishness. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved, a presence that made the biker second-guess his earlier assumptions. The observer turned back toward him, his face still calm, but there was something in his eyes now, something that sent a chill down the biker's spine. "You think this is just about you and that horse, don't you?" the observer said, his voice still low but laced with an undeniable edge. "You think because you can harm something smaller, weaker, that there will be no consequences. But you're wrong." The biker, feeling his bravado slipping, forced a chuckle. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but it was just a joke. I wasn't hurting anyone. Chill out, old man." The observer didn't react to the biker's words. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was unsettling. It was clear that he wasn't intimidated by the biker in the slightest. The biker, unsure whether to back off or confront him, stood his ground. "You may not have meant to cause harm," the observer said, his gaze never leaving the biker's face, "but actions have consequences, whether we intend them or not." The biker's grin faltered. He wanted to lash out, to prove he wasn't afraid of this old man, but something about the calm in the observer's voice made him hesitate. He had always been the one in control, the one who decided how things played out. But here, in this moment, he wasn't so sure. "Who are you, anyway?" the biker asked, his voice defensive but laced with uncertainty. The observer took a deep breath before responding, his words deliberate, like each one was carefully chosen. "I'm someone who has spent his life standing up for others. Someone who knows the difference between strength and power." The biker snorted, dismissing the seriousness in the observer's tone. "Yeah? Well, I'm just here to have a little fun. Nothing personal. Just a horse, man. No big deal." The observer stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "To you, it's nothing. But to others, it's everything." The biker's eyes narrowed. There was a subtle shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere that made him question whether he had gotten into something he wasn't prepared for. The observer wasn't just some guy defending a horse, there was something more at play here, something deeper. But the biker couldn't quite put his finger on it. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the biker muttered, taking a step back and clenching his fists. His confidence was slowly returning, fueled by defiance. The observer, however, remained unfazed. "I don't need to know who you are. I know what's right. And what you did was wrong." The biker glared at him, his chest tightening with the mix of anger and confusion. He had been in countless confrontations before, but something about this moment felt different. The observer's words were heavy, but it wasn't just the words, it was the way they were delivered. He wasn't just angry, he was calm, resolute, like he had already decided the outcome. The Mustang, sensing the tension between the two men, snorted and pawed at the ground. The observer turned his attention back to the horse, as if the confrontation had already moved past the biker's bravado. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the horse's hooves. Then, without another word, the observer turned his back on the biker and began walking away. The biker stood frozen, staring at the older man, wondering what would happen next. "Don't forget this moment," the observer called over his shoulder, his voice steady but carrying a weight that the biker couldn't ignore. "It's not over. Not by a long shot." The biker watched, a knot forming in his stomach. The words echoed in his mind as the observer disappeared into the distance, leaving him alone with the Mustang and a growing sense of dread that he couldn't shake. Something had changed. He had no idea what it was yet, but deep down, he knew that he had made a mistake. And it was a mistake that wouldn't be so easily forgotten. The suspense lingered in the air, and the biker couldn't escape the growing feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something much bigger than he could understand. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the field. The biker sat on his motorcycle, staring at the fading figure of the observer, still trying to process the strange encounter. He tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just some random confrontation with an old man. But the more he thought about it, the more his nerves gnawed at him. "Who the hell was that guy?" he muttered under his breath, starting up the engine and revving it to drown out the unsettling thoughts. "Just some old man with a stick up his ass." But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. He glanced at the Mustang, still standing where it had been kicked earlier, now calm but alert. The bike's engine roared to life, and the biker revved it once more before speeding off, the wind rushing past him as if it could blow away the strange tension in his chest. Hours later, after an evening spent drinking with friends, the biker pulled his motorcycle into a dimly lit parking lot of a local dive bar. As he got off the bike and lit a cigarette, he felt a lingering discomfort, an itch he couldn't scratch. It was like someone had been watching him, waiting. He leaned against the bike, taking a long drag, but just as he was about to turn toward the bar, a voice broke through the night air. "I didn't think I'd find you here." The biker spun around, startled. Standing there, under the flickering light of the street lamp, was the observer. His presence felt like a heavy weight. It was the same man, yet there was something different now, something more ominous. The biker felt his stomach drop. "What the hell do you want now?" he spat, trying to hold on to his bravado, but the words didn't come out as confidently as they had before. The observer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the biker's. This time, there was no calm, there was fire in his gaze. "I wanted to make sure you knew who you were dealing with," the observer said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "You see, I'm not just some old man who happens to care about horses." The biker's heart skipped a beat. What's that supposed to mean? The observer's face hardened, the air around them suddenly heavy with intent. "I've spent my life making sure people like you understand the consequences of their actions. I've worked for people who enforce the law, who make sure people face the consequences when they hurt others. And I'm one of them." The biker's confusion deepened, but the words began to sink in. "Wait. Are you some kind of cop or something?" The observer didn't smile. His voice was now stern, with a quiet intensity that sent chills through the biker. "Not a cop. But I know the law, and I've been trained to deal with situations like this. You made a choice today, and now you'll see what happens when you hurt something weaker than you." The biker's legs wobbled for a moment. This wasn't just a chance encounter, it was something much bigger. He started to feel the ground shift beneath him, as if the reality he had known for so long was crumbling. Was this really happening? The observer took a step closer, his eyes locked onto the biker's with a knowing, almost pitying gaze. "You think your motorcycle, your toughness, your bravado means something. But all it's done is mask the fact that you're nothing more than a coward hiding behind your ego. And that horse? It's the least of what you'll pay for." The biker's pulse raced, his mind spinning. He had expected a fight, maybe some harsh words, but not this. This man wasn't just some random stranger, he was someone with power, someone with connections. The biker had no idea how far this was going to go, but he knew now that he had stepped into something far beyond a petty confrontation. "I don't know what you want from me," the biker said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "But I didn't hurt anyone seriously. It was just a stupid prank." The observer's expression softened slightly, but his eyes were still intense. "You didn't hurt anyone seriously, but you hurt someone who matters. And now, you'll face the consequences. I've seen what happens when people like you think they're invincible. It doesn't end well." The biker swallowed hard, suddenly realizing just how much he didn't know. The world he lived in, the world of motorcycles, bar fights, and reckless pride, seemed so small now. He had no idea what kind of storm he had just kicked up. The observer turned to leave, but before he disappeared into the shadows, he added, "You'll have to reckon with this, one way or another. And the price you pay will be higher than you think." The biker stood there, his cigarette forgotten in his hand, the words echoing in his mind. The observer's parting words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long while, the biker felt small. He had no idea what this man was capable of, but deep down, he knew he wasn't ready for what was coming. And the Mustang wasn't the only thing that would face consequences. The next few days felt like they were dragging on forever. The biker couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep within him after his encounter with the observer. It wasn't just that the man had threatened him, it was the way he spoke, the calm authority in his voice. He wasn't a random person with a grudge. He was someone with power, someone who had connections and influence that the biker couldn't begin to understand. The biker tried to keep his usual routine. He visited the usual bars, hung out with his friends, and revved his motorcycle just like he always did. But no matter where he went, that uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at him. Every time he thought about the observer, a chill ran down his spine. It was in the middle of one of those ordinary nights, when he was sitting at the bar with a drink in hand, that things began to take an unexpected turn. He had just taken a sip from his glass when the door swung open, and in walked a man in a suit. The biker didn't pay much attention at first, assuming it was just another businessman looking for a drink after a long day. But then the man's eyes locked onto him. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and the biker's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the man's expression, something familiar. It was that same calm, controlled demeanor, the same look the observer had given him when they first crossed paths. The man walked toward him without hesitation, a purposeful stride in his step. The biker, unsettled, put his drink down and straightened up. He didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was, he could feel it coming. "You're him, aren't you?" the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable authority. "The one who kicked that horse." The biker's throat tightened. He tried to act casual, but the words felt like they were choking him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, forcing a smirk. "It was just a prank, nothing serious." The man didn't flinch. "Oh, I know exactly what it was. And it's not nothing." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You see, I'm someone who knows people. People who don't take kindly to what you did. And we've been keeping an eye on you." The biker's stomach churned. His initial arrogance began to crumble, replaced by a creeping fear that he couldn't suppress. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I didn't hurt anyone. It's over." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "It's far from over. You've already been flagged. You think you can walk away from this without consequences?" The biker's head spun. "Flagged? What the hell are you talking about?" The man straightened up and placed a business card on the table. "Consider this your warning. We don't forget things like this. We don't forget people like you." The biker stared at the card for a moment, trying to process what was happening. The man turned and walked away without another word, leaving the biker sitting there, his mind racing. A chill ran down his spine as the reality of what was unfolding hit him. The next day, the biker couldn't get the man's words out of his head. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. It was as if the world around him had changed overnight, and he was the only one who hadn't realized it. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the consequences of his careless act were catching up to him. It wasn't until a few days later, when he was walking down the street toward his bike, that the full weight of his actions finally hit him. A black car rolled slowly past him, its tinted windows reflecting the morning light. The biker barely had time to register the car before it stopped abruptly, the door opening without a sound. Before he could react, two men in suits stepped out of the car. Their faces were serious, unreadable. The biker's heart raced, and instinctively, he took a step back. These weren't just ordinary men. They carried themselves with an air of authority that made the biker feel like he was in the presence of something much larger than himself. One of the men spoke first, his voice cold and measured. "We need to talk." The biker's mind raced, but he didn't respond. He stood there, unsure of what to say, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're here because of a little incident you had with a horse," the man continued. "You don't have the luxury of ignoring it anymore. It's time to make things right." The biker opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He felt trapped, like a mouse in a corner, knowing there was no way out. The other man stepped forward, his gaze fixed firmly on the biker. "You don't understand the situation you've put yourself in. You hurt something that someone cares about. And now, you're going to have to answer for it." The biker swallowed hard, his body shaking. His bravado was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had never thought it would come to this. He had never thought that a simple, reckless act could have such far-reaching consequences. "Come with us," the first man said, and the biker realized that there was no escape. Whatever had been set in motion was beyond his control now. His fate had already been decided. As they led him to the black car, the biker couldn't shake the image of the Mustang, standing in the field, its eyes wide with fear. He had hurt that animal, sure. But what he didn't know then, what he hadn't realized, was that the price of his actions wasn't just about the horse. It was about facing the consequences of thinking he could go through life without ever answering for his mistakes. And now, those consequences were catching up with him. The biker sat in the back of the black car, feeling the weight of his situation more than ever. The interior was cold, the leather seats uninviting. The two men sat in front, their presence an unspoken reminder that there was no escape. They hadn't said much since they'd first entered the car, and every second of silence only deepened the biker's sense of dread. The car seemed to move endlessly through the streets, the city blurring by in the darkness. The biker's mind was racing. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble before, but this was different. There was no negotiating, no clever words he could use. The authority the two men exuded felt impenetrable. They didn't take him to a police station, or anywhere he recognized. Instead, the car pulled into a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked abandoned from the outside. But the moment the door opened, the biker was hit by the heavy scent of cleaning chemicals and steel. It felt sterile, like a place designed for business, not something you'd want to visit. "Get out," the first man said, his tone still icy. The biker hesitated. His instincts were screaming at him to bolt, to run, but he knew he was outmatched. The men's calm demeanor made it clear they had the upper hand, and trying to resist would only make things worse. He stepped out of the car and was immediately escorted into the building. The dim lighting created long shadows on the walls, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. He could hear the soft hum of machinery in the distance, the sound of something mechanical working, but it only added to the surreal feeling of being in a place he shouldn't be. They led him through a narrow corridor, stopping in front of a door that looked ordinary enough. But the second it opened, the biker was struck by the intense contrast. The room inside was far from ordinary. It was sleek and modern, a far cry from the industrial, gritty exterior of the building. A man in a suit sat at a desk, facing away from them. He had the same cold, authoritative air as the others, but his posture was relaxed, as if he'd been expecting them. The biker swallowed hard. His heart was racing now, and all he could think about was how far he had fallen from that moment in the field, when he thought it was just a joke. "Sit," the man at the desk said, his voice calm but commanding. The biker sat, but his mind was still spinning. He tried to keep himself composed, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. The two men who had brought him here stood at the door, watching silently. The man at the desk finally turned around, his eyes meeting the biker's. For a moment, the biker thought he might be able to see some hint of humanity in his gaze. But there was nothing, only a cold, calculating stare. "You've made quite an impression," the man said, folding his hands in front of him. "Not just with your actions, but with your attitude. You think that because you can be reckless, because you can push people around, that you're untouchable. That's where you're wrong." The biker's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there, his body tense, waiting for whatever was coming next. "You hurt an animal," the man continued. "A creature that, while it can't fight back the way you can, still has worth. And you thought you could get away with it. But this isn't just about the horse, it's about what happens when people like you take advantage of the weak." The biker's pulse quickened. The man's words were cutting deeper than he had anticipated, like each sentence was carving a path into his conscience. He had known what he did was wrong, but hearing it put so plainly, so starkly, made it feel like the weight of the world was bearing down on him. You're here because someone like you needs to learn a lesson. And in this world, lessons like these aren't given lightly, the man said, standing up. He walked around the desk, coming closer. But let me make one thing clear, we don't do this because we enjoy it. We do it because people like you need to be shown that actions have consequences. You've made your choices, and now you'll face them. The biker swallowed again, his fear rising. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of something like this. He had always been the one causing trouble, never the one who had to answer for it. And now, here he was, caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand, with no way to fight back. "What do you want from me?" the biker finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. The man at the desk smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was calculating, cold. "What we want is simple. We want you to understand that you're not above anyone else. You're not invincible. And we want you to make it right. No more running. No more pretending you can just do whatever you want." The biker's chest tightened. He had no idea how to make it right, how to fix something he had broken without even thinking about it. But he knew this wasn't something he could ignore. The observer, the two men, this room, it was all part of something much larger than a random prank. And now, he was caught in the web. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The consequences of his actions were deeper and more far-reaching than he had ever imagined. And the price he would have to pay for it, whatever it was still unknown. But one thing was clear, it wasn't going to be easy. The man behind the desk nodded slowly, as if reading the biker's thoughts. "You'll be given a chance to make amends. But this is only the beginning. And the road ahead won't be easy for you." The biker didn't respond. He was too lost in his own thoughts, trying to come to terms with what was happening. One thing was certain, though, he had underestimated the power of his actions, and now, the consequences were beginning to unfold in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. The biker sat in the cold, sterile room, the weight of the man's words sinking in deeper than ever. Every nerve in his body was on edge, but his mind refused to find clarity. What had he gotten himself into? How did a simple act of arrogance spiral into something so much bigger, so much more dangerous? The man at the desk studied him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem to care whether the biker understood the gravity of his situation. In fact, the coldness in his eyes suggested that he was more interested in seeing how the biker would respond than in offering any compassion. The biker's heart pounded in his chest, the reality of his choices creeping in. He had pushed too far. Now, there was no escaping the consequences. "You have two choices," the man finally said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was calm, almost clinical. "You can pay for your mistake in one of two ways, either by facing the legal repercussions of your actions, which could ruin your life, or by making things right, in a way that proves you've learned a lesson." The biker looked up, his head spinning. He had thought he understood what was at stake, but the decision before him felt too heavy to grasp. How do I make things right?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The man walked over to a nearby desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to the biker. "You'll find your answer in here. But know this, you can't back out once you open it. The decision is yours to make, but once you choose, there is no turning back." The biker took the envelope with trembling hands, unsure of what he was about to uncover. The man's cold eyes never left him as he slowly tore open the seal, unfolding the paper inside. Inside the envelope was a brief but clear set of instructions. It outlined a course of action, one that involved helping others in need, taking responsibility for his actions in a way that went beyond simple punishment. It was clear that whatever path he chose, he would have to give up something valuable to him, his time, his freedom, and the very arrogance that had led him to kick the Mustang in the first place. The final sentence struck him like a punch to the gut. You will never be the same again. The choice is yours. He felt his pulse race. This was no ordinary punishment. This was a chance at redemption, or a chance to lose it all. He had no idea what kind of task he was about to undertake, but there was one thing he knew for sure: he had been given an opportunity to prove that he could change. The price was steep, but it was the only path forward. The man at the desk, still standing across from him, seemed to read his thoughts. The choice is simple. Prove you are capable of real strength, strength that comes from humility, from sacrifice. Or face the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. The biker's mind raced. He had spent so many years running from the truth, pretending he didn't care, thinking that he could get away with anything. But now, with the choice before him, he realized how fragile his existence had been. A single moment of carelessness had opened his eyes to how quickly things could spiral out of control. He had never thought about making amends, never thought about truly changing. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of his own actions, the cost of what he had done. This wasn't about the horse anymore. It was about him. I don't have a choice, do I? He muttered, more to himself than to the man at the desk. No, the man said softly. You do. But it's not about what you want, it's about what you need. The biker exhaled slowly, his hands shaking. He could feel his world shifting beneath him. For the first time, he wasn't in control. For the first time, he was being forced to reckon with his own weaknesses. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The path ahead wasn't clear. He didn't know what he was about to face, or what kind of sacrifice would be required of him. But the one thing that was certain was that he couldn't go back to the life he had been living. This wasn't just about the horse. It was about finding something in himself that he didn't even know was there, a strength that didn't come from bravado or arrogance, but from facing his mistakes head-on. I'll do it, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'll make things right. The man nodded, his expression still unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. Good. We'll be watching. And we'll know if you truly mean it. With that, the biker stood, the weight of his decision sinking in. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges he wasn't prepared for. But it was the only road left for him. As he left the sterile room and walked into the night, he felt a sense of uncertainty settle over him. He had made a choice to change, to make things right. And although he didn't know where this path would lead, he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer the same man who had kicked that Mustang for fun. He was someone different now. Someone who would have to face the consequences of his actions, and prove that he could be better. And as the door closed behind him, the weight of his new reality settled in. This was just the beginning. The next few weeks felt like a blur for the biker. His world had been turned upside down, and the choice he made weighed on him with every passing day. He had no idea what kind of redemption was waiting for him, or what it would cost. All he knew was that there was no turning back now. He followed the instructions in the envelope, stepping into a world he had never even imagined. The tasks he was given were grueling, filled with physical labor and emotional challenge. At first, the biker couldn't understand why he was being asked to do things that seemed so menial, helping others in need, working with his hands to fix things he once would have considered beneath him. But slowly, as the days passed, he began to see a pattern. Each task was designed to strip away the layers of pride and arrogance he had built up over the years. It wasn't about doing big, heroic things, it was about learning humility. Learning that strength didn't come from dominating others or pushing them down, but from lifting them up. And as he worked alongside people who had nothing, who had fallen on hard times, he realized just how far he had fallen from the person he once was. One day, as he was fixing an old woman's broken fence, she sat on her porch and watched him quietly. Her face was lined with age, her eyes tired but kind. "You've been working hard," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I see something in you that wasn't here before. You're changing. Don't let the world harden you again. It's too easy to forget who you really are." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She didn't know his past, didn't know the mistakes he had made, but somehow, she could see through the layers of anger and pride that had kept him locked in his own world. She saw the change that was happening inside him. And in that moment, he realized that he couldn't go back to being the person he was before. He couldn't keep pretending that the world owed him something. The tasks continued, each one more challenging than the last. But with each challenge, he grew stronger, not physically, but emotionally. He learned how to listen, how to care for others without expecting anything in return. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was making a real difference in the world, even if it was just in small, quiet ways. But it wasn't always easy. There were days when the biker wanted to give up, when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear. There were moments when he felt like he was being punished for something he couldn't undo. But every time he stumbled, every time he felt like walking away, something inside him, something deeper than pride or ego, kept him going. He remembered the Mustang. He remembered the look in its eyes after he kicked it, the way it had stood there, helpless and afraid. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly sorry. To be broken by your mistakes, but still find the strength to rise again. It wasn't long before the observer reappeared, quietly watching from the distance, as if testing him, waiting to see if he had truly changed. The biker could feel his presence before he even turned around, that quiet but undeniable authority that had first unsettled him so many weeks ago. The observer walked up to him one day, just as he was finishing another task, a small job, fixing a car for a struggling family. The man's eyes scanned him silently, as if evaluating his every move. The biker had no idea what to expect. Would the observer acknowledge his progress? Or would he be dismissed, as though his efforts had never mattered? Finally, the observer spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've been watching. You've come a long way. But you still have much to prove." The biker nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride in his chest. "I know. I'm not who I was before. But I'm still learning." The observer didn't smile, but there was something in his expression, something almost approving. "Good. But remember, this isn't about what you can do for others. It's about who you are when no one is watching. The true test is what you choose to do when no one is there to hold you accountable. That's where the real change happens." The words hit him harder than anything else he had heard. He had been focused on the external, on making amends, on doing things to earn back his sense of worth. But the observer was right. The real change wasn't about the work he did for others. It was about the work he had to do within himself. The observer left as quietly as he had come, leaving the biker alone to reflect on what had just been said. There was still so much he needed to do, so many ways he still needed to grow. But for the first time, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like someone who was becoming whole again, someone who was worthy of redemption, no matter how long it took. As he continued down the path of self-discovery, he began to see the world through a different lens. He no longer saw people as obstacles or as objects to be controlled. He saw them as equals, each one deserving of respect, compassion, and understanding. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer lost. And that, he realized, was enough. As the days passed, the biker kept working, fixing fences, helping people in need, doing whatever small tasks he could to make things right. He never forgot the lesson he had learned, the lesson that had started with a simple, thoughtless act of cruelty toward a horse. But now, he was no longer that reckless man who had kicked the Mustang. He was someone different. Someone stronger, not because of his physical power, but because of the humility he had gained through his struggles. And though he would always carry the weight of his past mistakes, he knew that he was no longer defined by them. The journey wasn't over. But he was ready for whatever came next. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the small town the biker had found himself in. His hands, calloused from hard work, rested on the hood of a car he had just finished fixing for a family in need. The work wasn't glamorous, but it had its own kind of reward. Each task, each small act of kindness, was shaping him into the man he had never imagined he could be. He stood up from the car, wiping his hands on a rag, his mind far from the noise of the world that had once felt so important to him. His old life, the motorcycle clubs, the bar brawls, the pride and recklessness, now seemed like a distant memory, as if it belonged to someone else. The man he was now didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to hide behind bravado. He didn't need to be the loudest in the room. He was finally starting to understand the kind of strength that mattered most, the strength that came from within. As he walked through the quiet streets, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The days of grueling labor, of working with people who had so little but still managed to show kindness and gratitude, had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. The Mustang, the incident in the field, and the observer had all played a role in the transformation he was undergoing. But it wasn't the punishment or the hard work that had made the biggest difference, it was the quiet moments of reflection, the small steps he had taken to atone for his mistakes, that had allowed him to find peace. He remembered the first day he had met the observer. The man had seemed so sure of himself, so confident in his authority. The biker had felt trapped, cornered, unsure of how to move forward. But now, looking back, he understood the observer's words, the weight they carried. The man hadn't come to make him suffer. He had come to show him that redemption wasn't something that came easily, it had to be earned. And the only way to truly change was to face the consequences of your actions, to take responsibility for them, and to work toward becoming a better version of yourself, no matter how long it took. The biker reached the small park at the center of town, where he often went to think. There was an elderly couple sitting on a bench, enjoying the warm evening air. He smiled at them, his smile genuine now, something he hadn't allowed himself to do for a long time. The simple act of smiling at them, of acknowledging their presence, felt like another small victory, a reminder that he had changed. He sat down on a nearby bench, his mind still turning over the lessons he had learned. He thought about the old woman with the broken fence, the way she had seen the change in him before he had even recognized it himself. He thought about the Mustang, and how he had hurt something that was innocent and defenseless, something that had trusted him. And he thought about the family whose car he had fixed, who had been grateful even though they had nothing to offer in return. In each of these moments, he had learned that true strength wasn't about what you could take, it was about what you could give. It was about lifting others up, even when you were the one who had fallen. The observer had been right. The real test of a man wasn't in how he behaved when others were watching, but in how he acted when no one was looking. It was easy to do the right thing when there was someone to hold you accountable. But the real change came when you could look at yourself in the mirror and know that you were doing the right thing because it was the right thing, not because anyone was telling you to. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the town, the biker finally felt at peace. He had made his choice, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure, he would keep walking it, no matter how hard or long it took. The past would always be there, but it no longer had a hold on him. He had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing your mistakes. It was about owning them, learning from them, and making the conscious choice to do better. And for the first time in his life, the biker understood what it truly meant to be free, not from the consequences of his actions, but from the man he used to be. In that moment, as the stars began to appear in the night sky, the biker felt a quiet sense of pride. He had been given a second chance. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it with humility, strength, and the knowledge that the journey to becoming a better man had no end.